text, that's where this battle occurred. And when David knocked off Goliath's head, the Philistines run in the valley towards Gath and Ekron, which is right to the north. So we're dealing here right on the border between these two zones. Now, Gath has always been an interesting place, and from the very beginning of the archaeological research in Israel, people have been trying to find where Gath is. Now, what makes it a bit problematic is that there is no site in the ancient Philistia called Gath or something like Gath, as opposed to Ashkelon, which still today is called Ashkelon, or Gaza is still called Gaza, or Ashdod, or Jerusalem is called Jerusalem. There's no place called Gath. So over the last century, there have been a few suggestions about where Gath is located. Now, nowadays, I think we can say quite clearly, although we haven't yet found the sign "Welcome to Gath," the finds that we have, both archaeological and from an analysis of the texts that are available, it seems quite clear that Tel Safi is located here. But as someone said when I showed this slide, I should show a slide of the few sites in this region that weren't suggested as Gath. But this is an interesting point because it took many years to reach a scholarly consensus that, in fact, the site of Tel Safi is Gath, but I think that issue is down. Now, here you can see views of the site. It's a very large site, and one of the interesting features of the site is this white cliffs, these white chalk cliffs that are on the northwestern side of the site, and this is, in fact, gives the site its Arabic name. Tel Safi, Safi in Arabic means something like pure, something like of the sort, and various places where there are geographical features that are white in Arabic is called Isafi. And so this is the name of the site, and as you can see, Isafi has nothing to do with Gath, so it took us a while to reach this identification. Now, here's the site in a picture taken in the 1920s during the British Mandate of Palestine, and you can see here that the site, the upper mound is covered by a village, the village of Tel Safi. And below it, you can see most of the site is unsettled. Now, in 1899, two British explorers, Bliss and McAllister, excavated on the site for 2 weeks. And very fortunate for us, they didn't get along with the local villagers, and they left after 2 weeks because everywhere else these two people excavated, they basically destroyed the sites and reported very poorly. So the fact that they left the site enabled us to excavate extensively. Now, when we reached the site in 1997, one of the major problems is that big parts of the upper Tel, that's this horseshoe-shaped hill that you see over here, were covered by the remains of this modern Palestinian village, which was abandoned in 1948 during the Israeli War of Independence, and the graveyards which are associated with it. And so basically, large parts of the upper Tel were inaccessible. And this, in fact, is the reason why since 1899 till 1997, when we started excavating, nobody excavated the site. But after we conducted a surface survey, it turned out that there were major parts of the site where we could get to the earlier Bronze and Iron Age remains and not have to go through the later medieval and modern remains. And basically, since then, we've been following the areas where we can get to the earlier remains and not have to dig through the later layers. Now, here's an aerial photograph and a general plan of the site. And just to give you an idea of some of the areas that we're working on, just to give a concept, that's 100 meters, about 100 yards. So you can see it's a very large site. And we're excavating in various excavation areas on the eastern side of the Tel, on the summit, in the lower city, a burial zone, and the siege system, which we'll talk about soon. And I'll return to these areas as we move along. Now, as in many ancient Middle Eastern sites, as Gil mentioned beforehand, it's a stratified, multi-period site, one culture above the other, one culture of the other above the other. And I don't want to get into the details, but it goes from the early Bronze Age all the way to the modern period. And we're going to be focusing in this lecture only on part of the story, the Iron Age, from about 1200 to about 586. This is the period which, if you take it into biblical terms, this is the period from the appearance of the Israelites in Canaan until the destruction of the first temple. And it's in archaeological terms called the Iron Age, the Philistines appearing here, and slowly the Iron Age develops, and the end of the Iron Age, at least from a historical point of view, in this region is marked by the Babylonian campaigns in which, among other things, they destroyed Jerusalem in 586. Now, we start looking at the finds, and we can start seeing all kinds of very typical pottery that appears when the Philistines first appeared that are completely non-local. And this goes for cooking vessels, serving vessels, and a whole slew of other objects. We see very interesting cultic objects. For example, this fascinating chalice, which has on it these decorated bird heads, and it's painted as well, along with other vessels of local and non-local origins. And all this shows us that all kinds of new cultural attributes are appearing in this culture at the time, indicating that there is a lot of new non-local influences in Philistia at the time. And perhaps the best known of the Philistine culture is the Philistine bichrome ware, which you can see examples here. And this is a piece of bichrome pottery that we found just this summer at Tel Asafi. And one of the iconic attributes of the bichrome pottery are these beautiful birds. Yesterday I gave a lecture at University of Kansas, and the mascot of the basketball team is the Jayhawk. So they like the bird very much. But I don't know what the mascot of the what is it, a pizza of the anyway, so now another very interesting thing is that we know very little about the Philistines and how they buried themselves. I mean, they didn't bury themselves, they buried the Philistines. What we do know is that the Philistines died. And what's a very interesting aspect is that in all the major Philistine sites, we don't have any recognized formal cemeteries. Now, this is a very interesting question. Is it because we haven't looked enough? Is it because the Philistines didn't bury their dead, threw them out in the fields? Or perhaps they buried them, they cremated them and spread the ashes, or they threw them out in the sea? We don't know, but we really don't have a lot of evidence. And so one of the things that we've been doing a lot is walking around the site on a very wide area to try to find areas which we might identify burials. And in fact, in this valley, we came upon about 20 to 30 cave openings, which we decided to excavate one of them. And here you can see the excavation of this tomb. You know, I'm playing a Philistine here. And what we had here is a very interesting thing, both from an archaeological point of view, but from also a modern point of view, is that this tomb and the tombs around it had been looted by a Bedouin who lives 200 meters from this excavation. And when we were excavating this tomb, he came over and says, "Oh yeah, I dug that 10 years ago," and then he was very disappointed because we started finding things, and it turns out that they had taken the things out of the tomb, and at some stage part of the roof collapsed, so they left the tomb. And they had thought they had excavated the entire contents of the tomb, and in fact, though, we were fortunate they left us some of the objects, and it gives us a nice view of what the Philistines put in their tombs at the time. Unfortunately, because it was looted, we couldn't see how they actually buried the skeletons, buried the people. But what was very interesting when we studied the bones, it turns out that these people were extremely unhealthy, had a horrendous diet, and perhaps like most people in antiquity, lived a very short and extremely painful life. And this is very important to remember, is that life in antiquity was very, very different from life that we know it today. And I think it's true for the Philistines. It's true for anybody you go in ancient times. Now, another very interesting thing is starting to look at the Philistine diet. Now, how do we look at the Philistine diet? We look at the Philistine diet based on the archaeological remains. And we can see now from an analysis of animal bones is that when the Philistines appear in Canaan, at many, but not all of the Philistine sites, we can see that there is a consistent use of pig and dog in their diet. And as opposed to the Canaanites, and in most cases the Israelites, you don't have use of pig. Now, it's not clear-cut. I mean, in the past, it's been suggested if you find pig bones, it's a Philistine site. If you don't find pig bones, it's an Israelite site. It's more complex than that. But nevertheless, there is some sort of a general trend. And by the way, the lack of the fact that the Israelites abstained, or maybe the Judahites abstained from eating pig, perhaps is the earliest evidence of the initial stages of what afterwards becomes the Jewish dietary laws, the kashrut laws. At this stage, it's very different from the what we know today. But I'll wake you up for a second. I'll tell you a joke. Moses on Mount Sinai, and God says to him, "Thou shalt not boil a kid in his mother's milk." So Moses says, "So that means we have to separate between milk and meat dishes?" He says, No. Thou shalt not boil a kid in his milk. Oh, so we have to wait 6 hours between meat and milk? No, that means thou shalt not boil a kid in his boiled meat. So that means that we also can't eat chicken and milk? Oh, do whatever you want to. Anyway, so now, one of the interesting things that we moved ahead with is we started analyzing the ancient DNA of the pig bones. And it turned out that we can identify, based on the DNA of the pig bones found in the land of Israel from the Middle Bronze Age until the Roman period, that at a very specific point in time, in the beginning of the Iron Age, there's an influx of European pig DNA. And believe it or not, they can differentiate between European and Levantine pig DNA. And what this indicates is that when the Philistines came, they brought with them, whether on their ships or in their carts, squealing pigs. And these pigs settled and eventually dominated the local pig genome and took over from the local Levantines. So this is a very interesting microscopic way of showing the actual Philistine presence and what happened when they arrived. The same thing can be said about plant use. There are unique types of plants which appear first when the Philistines arrive, and also we can see different types of plant use. That means they use plants in a different way from the locals, and again, this indicates from where they're coming, and again, it points out towards the western and northwestern Mediterranean. Now, as I said before, it's not only the food, but how they cook the food. And when we look at the ways they cook, whether it's on the hearths, which we know are connected, and we see these things in Cyprus, or when the early Philistines arrive, we see suddenly the appearance of closed cooking jugs, as opposed to the Canaanites and the Israelites, who cooked in large open cooking vessels. The Philistines cooked their food in closed ones. Now, why does this happen? Because wherever the Philistines came from, they came with their own cooking traditions. And as we know, who you are is what you eat. And people want to eat their cultural foods. And so if imagine a guy from Athens comes, he wants to have souvlaki. He has to make souvlaki in a vessel that you make souvlaki. And you can't make souvlaki in a vessel that you cook Canaanite stew in. So that's why we have these things appearing.